Today we'll be talking about a few other different things that are commonly understood in some ways about Scientology publicly, but with details that aren't usually very well known to other people. One of the first things is, this is something we discussed a number of times, about where Dianetics, which was comparable in some way to psychology, bridged the gap and became more of a spiritual thing. And that happened around what time?
Well, what happened was when the Dianetics book came out, it was really intended to help a person overcome the effects of traumatic experiences that they'd had. It was a very popular self-help book. It was the first #1 self-help bestseller that ever, was published. And, very quickly, within 6 months, there was like a couple 100,000 people that had bought the book, were auditing each other, and there was no organization, there was no Church of Scientology. There started up a Dianetic Foundation.
Study groups? You mentioned study groups.
Yeah, there were some study groups, but they were individual, and they were just people who got together, and there was no official organization. But anyway, what happened, two things started to happen. First thing is that people started going earlier than this lifetime. They started running past life experiences, and at first this was met with a great deal of skepticism, but what was happening was that people were actually resolving chronic physical problems by running out, contacting and discharging past life experiences.
But before that point, the idea was more to go to early life, even prenatal experiences. That was kind of the focus before, right?
Well, sure. Dianetics, if you read the Dianetics book, it's only this lifetime, and the basic is conception, and then there's the prenatal track, your birth, then there's your accidents, illnesses, and injuries. So the purpose of Dianetics was to run out any accidents, illnesses, and injuries that the person had this lifetime, contact and discharge birth, and whatever that, however much that helped somebody, and then whatever their prenatal track was, and then you were done. So it was like 25, 35 hours of auditing with most people. Then you were done with Dianetics, really. So, what happened was that people started running past lives. So this brought up some very interesting questions. And if you accepted the reality of past lives, then Hubard asked the reverse question, and that is, how come people forgot these things? And the other thing that happened was that people started having out-of-body experiences. They'd have some kind of wind, and they'd find themselves up the corner of the room looking down at their body.
Right.
And so if the...
So that's exteriorization, which is different from depersonalization. Because I know that some people describe feeling like they're not in their body, or they don't recognize themselves. That's depersonalization. But you're saying exteriorization, where they actually are outside their body as far as location.
They either could feel much larger than their body, they could feel like they backed up behind their body or sort of up over their body, or they could be a complete viewpoint of a different viewpoint in the environment. Could be any of those things, really. But again, Hubard asked the opposite question: if someone's awareness and consciousness was detachable from their physical body, how did it get stuck there in the first place?
Or why did they need it? Or if they needed it?
That's really when Dianetics started to edge over into Scientology. Scientology meant to answer these spiritual questions. Why have people forgotten their track and their experiences? Why are people so limited into their physical body when they could have a much broader perspective? And Scientology really is the exploration of those issues, and that really started in 1951.
Okay.
Again, before there was any Church of Scientology, there was no Church of Scientology.
When people look back at the history of Scientology as a church, they always, they bring up the Hubard quote of making money for whatever that's worth. But the idea is that there's a historical aspect where there was definitely a financial impetus to become a church, taxation things, and a whole bunch of corporations form. We know about all that. Both profit and non-profit entities, all connected in a complex matrix there. And there's people who talked about, doing it for all kinds of political reasons, becoming a church. But now what you're describing is really the aspect of being in the trenches, what was going on within the actual field of study versus the organization.
That's right. And there's an important point about this whole evolution into becoming a church, and that is that the comment that you mentioned about you could make more money if you started a religion, that was in the 40s. LRH talked about that, or that quote was from I think 48 or 47.
But it wasn't some intentional foreshadowing, in your opinion.
Well, Dianetics wasn't a church. Dianetics wasn't a religion. So if he really was trying to start a religion, it wouldn't have been Dianetics.
Right.
See? But the actual impetus for making it into a church was this. See, when Dianetics first came out, it was 1950. If you look at what was going on in 1950 in the field of mental health. Well, 1950 was the heyday of the lobotomy. The lobotomies started around 1948 and then went up until around 52, 53 before they kind of died out. But during that period of time, several 100,000 people were being given lobotomies.
Was electroshock one of the other issues at the time? Or was that later?
No, electroshock came in later, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, but there was also, but they had kind of an idea that you could kind of shock a person out of mental problems. So they had insulin shock. They were trying out freezing water, putting people in freezing water. There was several of those kind of solutions.
Sure.
So Dianetics came out. Well, Dianetics attracted a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists. Probably a third of the original Dianeticists were psychiatrists and psychologists who were studying Dianetics. And this got the attention of the APA. I was at a college reunion one time, and I sat next to this man, and we got to talk, and I said, "Oh, I'm in Scientology." He says, "Oh," he says, "You probably won't want to talk to me." And I said, "Well, why not?" He says, "I wrote the original review of Dianetics in the Journal of American Psychiatry," and he was like a top guy in the APA, and the guy across the table was the head of the psychosomatic illness department at UCLA. Anyway, we had a nice talk. They were nice people.
Wow. That had to be interesting, though. There'll be a fly on the wall for that.
Well, I did ask him. I said, "Well, so how's the APA getting along with Scientology these days?" And he said, "Well," he says, "if they leave us alone, we'll leave them alone."
Yeah, there's a lot. I know there's a lot of propaganda about the whole industry of death and all that other stuff going on, And obviously, it's based in fears that there's always a truth underlying something,
Well, they've evolved as well, so
sure.
I don't have an axe to grind there. I'm just, in terms of the history of it, what I'm trying to say is that there was a sort of a lot of tension between the mental health establishment and Dianetics and Scientology.
Right.
And in California, there was a proposal in the legislature to make Dianetic counselors or Scientology counselors be licensed by the state. And the state board that would license them would be all psychiatrists and psychologists. That was the impetus for forming Scientology into a church, because they did not want to be under state licensing requirements that would be controlled by the mental health establishment.
I was not even aware of that aspect of it.
That was because I have the original magazines and magazine articles and from that time, from 1954, where Hubard talked about how this came up and why, and he was advised that this would be the thing to do.
Could you have conceived of it being an amicable relationship over time, where the accountability and peer review and all those things would have given a potential legitimization and therefore a more widespread access to Scientology? Well,
yeah, there was a certain amount of not invented here rejection of it. In other words, who was Hubard? He was a science fiction writer who, and so you had all.
Well, Einstein was a file clerk too, but.
Well, I know. But I'm just saying that you had the whole academic viewpoint and the professional groups. I think
But
there was
psychologists were interested in it to the point where they were studying it.
exactly, and
Yeah.
I think that the antagonism came from the professional groups, the AMA and the APA, rather than from any specific,
Okay.
animosity. I think, in fact, a lot of people were quite open to it at the time. A lot of the mental health professionals, and in fact, even today, I think a lot of them have incorporated variations of, those techniques into their practices.
I have seen some similarities in some of the basic concepts, definitely. Whether they were Hubbard or pre-Hubbard, that's to be seen, but it seems like a lot of the things that I've experienced out there remind me of things that I've seen in Scientology and shoots that have come off of it over the last, half a century or so.
Sure. And the main difference really was that Scientology, even though, started as Dianetics, which was really about the mind, it really went off into more of a spiritual direction.
Sure.
And whereas, psychology, psychiatry deals with physical, mental, they deal with mental problems as physical problems, or at least problems that can be resolved by talking about them with a therapist or that kind of thing. But there's no real, there was a conscious decision in the field of mental health to eliminate the spiritual aspect because they thought it was progressive back in the late 1800s.
Right.
Because there was, as barbaric as lobotomies and so on, that was considered to be very progressive at the time. Because if you look a little bit earlier than that, people were in these mental institutions and chained to beds and things like that because they couldn't control them. So it was considered, well, if you lobotomize somebody, at least they can walk around and you don't have to keep them chained down. And that was considered a huge improvement over the previous solution for mental problems, which was sticking your retarded son in the attic and taking food up to him until he died. Yeah. And that was a huge improvement over the earlier solution, which was burning people at the stake because they were possessed by devils.
So when Scientology came on the scene, it seems like there's a lot of reasons. It's a lot more complicated than people want to paint it as just being a black or white, well, Hubbard didn't get along with the whatever. There were a lot of things going on with an awful lot of different groups of people and different interests. And part of it was a spiritual aspect. So at the time, Scientology, they were becoming churchified to purposely not fit the mold that they might have been cast in if they had maintained themselves as purely a mental health practice.
Well, they wanted to be free to practice.
Right.
Without, government interference. And that
Sure.
was really the motivation.
But it's also the fact they weren't making up the spiritual aspect of it. In order to do that, it was already present, is what you're saying.
Oh, yeah, it had been present for at least 3 years. In 1951, in The Science of Survival, he talks about discovering the source of life, the theta of an individual,
Sure. So when was the official churchification? It was
54.
So okay, so early on, that's when they handed out the Roman collars and changed a bunch of titles and names and things.
That wasn't until that was in the early 70s.
Okay, that's right. That was during the battles with the IRS and that kind of stuff.
That's
right. So that was a whole second wave of socio-political circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I got into Scientology. It was the Church of Scientology, but there was nothing churchy about it. I mean, really.
Right. Well, it was definitely not a traditional church,
Well, no. I mean, it was, but it wasn't. But then they got this. But that got them a lot of heat. So.
But they dealt with spiritual issues, is what we're saying. It wasn't just alternative medicine.
Not spiritual symbols necessarily, but in the 60s there was a push, and it started around 69. There was a push to have a religious image, so that we're auditors, wore these collars and so on and that kind of thing. And,
sure.
and they were all trained as ministers. They had to be certified as ministers. Before that, they were just auditors. So there was an attempt to.
So have you ever wore the collar? Or?
No, I never did.
Yeah.
There was an attempt to adopt the symbolism that would be recognized by society as being part of some kind of church.
Sure.
But the truth is that they'd always been a church in the sense that they were dealing with spiritual issues.
Wow. Well, I think that really gives a very different perspective from the newspaper reporting the power plays and the more cold historical accounts and debates. That really does give a lot of insight.